They only saw the fists, the blur of leather gloves slicing through the air, the devastating left hand that cut through world champions like a blade through silk. Manny Pacquiao, the Pac-Man, was a phenomenon of force, speed, and grace, a storm in human form. But no one ever paused to wonder what those hands were carrying. No one saw the silence behind the punches. He had always known how to perform pain without showing it. Even as a boy in the dirt paths of Kibawe, he learned to smile through hunger, smile through the ache of an empty belly, smile when his father left, when his mother cried, when the roof leaked and the neighbors pitied them. Fighting came naturally to him, not just with his hands, but with his spirit. But behind every early morning run and every training session in makeshift gyms, there was a shadow he never outran, a secret that clung to him like sweat, refusing to dry no matter how high he climbed. He was still a teenager when it happened, still poor, still angry at a world that seemed to thrive on forgetting people like him. The moment that would follow him for 15 years wasn't loud or cinematic. It was quiet, an alley, a flash of panic, a mistake, one choice, and afterward, silence. A silence that he would carry with him into every locker room, every ring walk, every prayer whispered before the bell rang. It had started with someone close to him, someone family, but not by blood. A man who had protected him, trained with him, once shared bread with him when there wasn't enough to go around. That night, something went wrong. There was a confrontation, a knife, a wound. Manny never spoke of the details, only that he took the fall, not legally, not publicly, but personally. He chose to say nothing, to walk away from a truth that might destroy more than just his shot at a future. If he told the truth, the man he owed everything to would be gone, and with him, the last shred of trust Manny had in the world. So he stayed quiet. Let the consequences redirect his path. He was exiled from one training circle, shunned by local figures in the boxing scene who whispered rumors without confirmation. That was when he turned to the underground circuits. Small-time fights in dirty gyms, the kind of places where a man's life could end between rounds without anyone asking why. There, he fought not for belts, but for survival. And somehow, that's where he bloomed. In the mud, in the dark. The irony, of course, was that the lie birthed the legend. Every step toward global stardom was paved over the thing he refused to face. When he moved up in weight classes, shocking the world with his relentless aggression and uncanny speed, the media called him the people's champ. But he knew the truth. The people didn't know who he really was. Not entirely, and he couldn't blame them. He had never told them. He couldn't. The silence became muscle memory. He trained with it, carried it into every weigh-in, every press conference. It lived in the tightness of his jaw during interviews. It pulsed in the veins of his clenched fists when his name was called. And yet, despite the pressure, he performed. He dominated. Behind closed doors, though, it wore on him. Nights alone in hotel rooms after title defenses, he would stare at the ceiling and wonder, would it always be like this? Would he always be performing, not just as a boxer, but as a man? There were moments when he thought of telling someone, his wife, his pastor, even the cameras. But every time, he hesitated, not out of cowardice, but out of loyalty. That was the cruel bind of it. The very honor he thought he was upholding was also the chain around his spirit. As the victories piled up, so did the complexity of his life. He became not just a fighter, but a symbol, a politician, a born-again Christian, a voice for the poor, a global ambassador for the Philippines. But every title only made the truth harder to carry. How could a man confess weakness when the entire nation leaned on his strength? And yet, there were cracks, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. After his losses to Eric Morales and later to Juan Manuel Marquez, he began to change. Not in the way the fans noticed, not just in the ring, but in his demeanor. He spoke more about God, about forgiveness, about redemption. He held his children closer, held his Bible tighter. Something inside him was shifting, but the silence was still there. It came with him to Las Vegas, to Macau, to Manila, to every dressing room where he wrapped his hands and stared into the mirror before a fight. He would look into his own eyes and search for the young boy he once was. The boy who ran barefoot to sell bread on the streets, who curled up in corners of city buses to sleep after late-night training sessions. Sometimes he could still see that boy. Sometimes he feared the boy would see through him. The public never asked for this part of the story. They cheered the knockouts, they posted the slow-motion highlights, but the man behind the gloves, he lived in another tempo, one filled with echoes and silence. There's a strange duality in becoming a legend. The louder the crowd, the lonelier it can feel. Manny Pacquiao understood that in ways few could. He had walked through fireworks and parades, through political rallies and title parades, with the weight of a single secret pressing against his lungs like a phantom opponent. He could throw punches faster than the eye could follow, but against the truth he was frozen. Still, he told himself it was the right thing. That silence was mercy. That some truths could destroy more lives than they saved. That by keeping quiet, he was protecting not just himself, but others. He needed to believe that. He had to. But every lie, spoken or unspoken, has a lifespan. And as the years passed and the fight slowed and the cheers began to fade, Manny felt it approaching. The moment when the silence would break, when the truth he buried 15 years ago would come to the surface, not as a confession, but as a reckoning. And deep inside, he feared not the judgment, but the freedom. Because once he spoke it, there would be no going back. And that moment was coming. He was a congressman now, a senator, a national hero whose name echoed in schools, parliaments, and churches. Manny Pacquiao was more than a fighter. He was a living symbol of what the Filipino people could survive and who they could become. And yet inside, he was unraveling. The thing about secrets is that they don't sleep. They wait, they stretch, settle, and grow like vines in the cracks of your foundation, quiet and patient until they find a weakness. Manny had kept his buried for so long, he had convinced himself it had died. But secrets don't die, they ferment. And what once had been a single decision, a choice made in fear and loyalty, had evolved into something else, shame. Not just for what had happened, but for what he had become by hiding it. After every victory, he used to feel euphoria, but that started to fade. The roar of the crowd became duller, the belt in his hand felt colder. There were nights, after fights he had won by unanimous decision, where he sat in the corner of a luxurious hotel suite, looking out at a glittering skyline and felt nothing. Just exhaustion, emptiness, an ache he could never stretch out. The first time he noticed something had changed was in the days following his knockout loss to Juan Manuel Marquez. That right hand hadn't just sent him to the canvas, it had sent him somewhere deeper. He lay there, not just dazed from the blow, but stripped, vulnerable, exposed. It was as if the body that hit the mat was not just his fighter self, but every layer of armor he had spent years building. He didn't know it then, but that fight marked the beginning of the end of his silence. That loss was more than physical. It cracked something in him, and what seeped through those cracks was the past, not in images, but in feelings, anxiety, dread, regret. He began waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding from dreams he couldn't fully remember. And when he did remember them, it was always the same scenario. A dark alley, the sound of footsteps behind him, and the feeling of being watched, not by someone else, but by his younger self, eyes wide with disapproval. He turned harder toward faith. He read the Bible more obsessively, prayed longer, louder. He cried in private. He apologized to God for things he wouldn't name out loud. He gave money, built houses, funded schools, preached in churches. He was desperate to do good, to weigh the scales back in his favor, to smother the voice in his chest that kept whispering, "Tell them, tell the truth." But he couldn't. He told himself the timing wasn't right. He had too much responsibility now, too many people who believed in him, depended on him. The truth would tear it all apart. His career, his political reputation, his family's safety, even the legacy of the man he'd once protected by keeping his silence. And so he chose to carry it longer, thinking the weight might become lighter if he just got stronger. He didn't get stronger, he just got quieter. In interviews, he began to give answers that circled around things. When journalists asked about the hardest moments of his life, he talked about poverty, perseverance, God. But not that night, not that choice. He dodged it like a trained counterpuncher, always moving, always deflecting. But the pressure was building, and something in him knew it was nearing a breaking point. Then, during a return to the province where he'd grown up, a political visit meant to inspire rural development and push legislative initiatives, he encountered a face from the past. A face that didn't smile, that didn't applaud, that didn't ask for a photo. He saw the man before the man saw him. Older now, a little hunched, but unmistakable. The man he had once saved, the man whose mistake had become Manny's burden. Their eyes locked for a second too long. Neither spoke. And in that silence, something deep in Manny ruptured. That night, back in his hotel, he wept. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a public figure, but the raw sobbing of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, staring out at the same fields he had once run across as a boy, barefoot and dreaming, and the truth hit him harder than any punch ever had. He wasn't free. He had never been. All the wealth, the power, the admiration, it had built a golden cage around a truth that still beat inside him like a second heart. He had convinced himself he was protecting people, that the silence was noble. But in that moment, he saw it for what it really was. Fear. Fear of losing control, of being exposed, of being human in front of people who expected him to be more. But how could he keep living like this? He began to test the idea of confession in his mind. Not in speeches, not in politics, but in truth. Real truth. The kind that risks, the kind that costs something, the kind that purifies. He thought of his wife, Jinky, of his children. What would they think? What would they say? Would they understand? Could they forgive him, not for the past, but for the silence, for the years he'd spent locked in it? And then he thought of the people, the ones who watched him with tearful eyes after his victories, the ones who called him Pambansang Kamau, the nation's fist. What would they do when they realized the fist had been hiding something all along? He didn't know, but for the first time, he was willing to find out. In the weeks that followed, Manny moved through the world differently. He watched people more closely, spoke more slowly. He was quieter, but in a different way. Not with fear, but with weight, with awareness. He started speaking more openly in private meetings. Not about the secret, not yet, but about responsibility, about vulnerability, about the cost of carrying burdens in silence. He began preparing the ground, though he didn't fully understand why. He only knew something had changed. The fight inside him was no longer about titles or re-election or even approval. It was about something deeper, a hunger to be whole, to be free, to be true. The decision hadn't been made yet, not fully. He hadn't rehearsed the words, he hadn't told his team, but in his heart something was shifting. The lie was dying, slowly, painfully. And in its place, a kind of courage he hadn't known he possessed was beginning to grow. It wouldn't be easy. He knew that. The truth would come at a cost. But so had the silence, and after 15 years, he was beginning to understand the difference between carrying a cross and choosing to die on it. There wasn't a press release, no grand trailer announcing a bombshell, just a quiet message to one of the more trusted interviewers in the Philippines. Manny is ready to speak. He doesn't want to talk about boxing. That was all it said. And for a man like Manny Pacquiao, whose entire life had been narrated through punches, titles, and victories, it was already enough to stir unease and curiosity across the nation. When the day came, the cameras rolled in a modest studio. No entourage, no wife, no political aides, no gloves. Just Manny, seated in a plain chair, the same one they use for politicians and civil servants. But he wasn't either of those today. He wasn't a senator or a champion. He looked small in the chair, not weak, just bare. He smiled politely, softly, not the polished grin of televised debates, nor the exuberant showman's smile from pay-per-view weigh-ins. This smile was different, faint, uncertain, honest. "I've never done this before," he said. "I don't know if I will do it right." The interviewer nodded, giving him space. Manny took a breath and began. No script, no bullet points, just the voice of a man carrying a truth he could no longer bear to drag behind him. He started with the early years, the childhood that everyone knew, the hunger, the dreams, the streets. But this time, his voice didn't carry the usual pride. It was marked by reflection, by pauses that weren't for effect, but for steadiness. He moved into the beginning of his boxing career, the places he trained, the people who took him in. And then his tone shifted. His eyes dropped. "I've been keeping something from the public, from the world, from my family even," he said almost in a whisper. "There was a moment in my life, before the fame, before America, before all the lights, that changed everything for me. Not because of what it did to my career, but because of what it did to who I am." He paused again. You could hear the silence in the studio, the kind that tightens around the chest. He looked straight at the camera. "I was involved in a violent incident. I was young, angry. I was trying to protect someone close to me, someone I loved like blood. They were in trouble, real trouble. And they asked me not to say anything. They begged me. I didn't know what was right. I didn't know what justice meant back then. All I knew was loyalty. So I kept quiet. I didn't lie to the police. But I didn't tell the truth either. I just left." The words came slowly, like a man peeling back bandages that had been sealed for too long. "That incident, it pushed me out of my community. I was forced to fight in underground circuits for a time, and no one ever really asked why. I let people believe I was just a kid trying to make it. But I knew why. I carried it with me." He explained how, in his silence, the myth of Manny Pacquiao had risen, how every fight he won felt like penance, how every punch was thrown not just at his opponent, but at his own guilt. The title fights, the endorsements, the stadiums filled with chants, none of it could silence what lived inside him. The voice that kept asking, was it worth it? "I thought I was protecting someone else," he continued, his voice breaking for the first time. "But maybe I was also protecting myself, from judgment, from shame, from losing everything I'd built." The interviewer remained silent, letting it all hang in the air. "I'm telling this now because I can't move forward without it. I've tried. I've tried to serve my country, to honor God, to be a good husband, a good father, but I was still hiding, and that's no way to live. That's not what being a man is." He bowed his head, hands trembling slightly in his lap. "I've asked for forgiveness from God. But I realized I needed to ask for forgiveness from people too, even if they never knew, even if they never suspected. I needed to say it, out loud." For a moment, no one spoke. The crew behind the camera didn't move. The interviewer didn't jump in. The moment was too real to interrupt. Manny wiped his face with his sleeve, straightened his back, and looked up again. I know this might disappoint some of you. Maybe you'll think less of me. Maybe you'll say I should have stayed quiet. But silence is a prison, and I want to be free. The interview concluded without any dramatic music or triumphant fade-outs. Manny stood, nodded in thanks, and walked off set. There was no applause, just stillness. But outside that studio, the world exploded. The video spread within hours. News outlets picked it up immediately. Social media erupted with opinions, arguments, admiration, disbelief. Hashtags in Tagalog and English flooded the timelines. Pacquiao truth trended for days. Analysts debated the timing. Some questioned his motives. Others said it was political strategy. But something strange happened amid the noise. People listened. The nation, long accustomed to scandals followed by denials, was stunned not by the nature of his confession, but by the purity of it. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't point fingers. He didn't position himself as a victim. He just told the truth. It changed how people saw him, not as a lesser man, but as a fuller one, flawed, fallible, and brave enough to admit it. In the days that followed, something shifted in Pacquiao himself. He was lighter. He smiled without force. He walked with a looseness that hadn't been there in years. In speeches, he seemed more present. When asked about the confession, he said only, "I did what I should have done a long time ago, that's all." His family stood by him. Jinky, quiet and graceful, said it best. "I married Manny, the whole man, not just the champion." In Congress, there was tension. Some political opponents tried to weaponize the confession, but it didn't stick. Because people, deep down, weren't interested in punishment. They were interested in truth. In a country so often betrayed by its leaders, Pacquiao had done something rare. He had told the truth without being caught first. And that meant something. He returned to public life with a new clarity. He no longer dodged hard questions. He didn't pretend to be perfect. And because of that, people began to see themselves in him more clearly. Not as a demigod in gloves, but as a man who fell, who hid, who rose, and who finally spoke. Years later, when asked what his proudest moment was, not the titles, not the Mayweather fight, not even the political victories, he gave a quiet answer. "The day I told the truth, because that was the first day I didn't have to fight anymore." And in that single sentence, he rewrote the meaning of strength, not as silence, not as myth, but as the courage to be real. Manny Pacquiao, for the first time in his life, wasn't defined by what he had won. He was defined by what he had released.